So Andrew Schulz has managed to make the situation between him and Kendrick, if you can call it any kind of situation, even weirder. It's already a strange thing. You couldn't even call it a beef, although at this point it might turn into that. So basically, Andrew Schulz made some comments, made a joke in reference to a black woman that people deemed to be racist. He kind of half-assed apologized for it. He did the whole kind of, I'm a comedian, this is my platform, we're just joking, you gotta take a joke, blah, blah, blah. And Kendrick put out a song where he said that, basically the black community can't allow white comedians to make jokes about black women. And so he didn't mention Andrew Schulz's name. And to be fair, the comments from Andrew Schulz didn't have anything to do with Kendrick. So what Kendrick was saying was more of a sort of general thing, basically saying that people let comedians get away with too much. And he's not talking about Andrew Schulz's free speech, to be clear, because free speech has to do with the government. Free speech is the government's ability to censor you. And that's not what Kendrick was appealing to. Kendrick was appealing to essentially black people not allowing somebody in Andrew Schulz's position to make a mockery of them, and essentially just the idea of protecting black women in general. But again, he didn't say his name. He kind of just threw it out there. It was a pretty direct shot, and the way people are paying such close attention to everything Kendrick says at this point, it didn't take long for people to kind of discern that he was talking about Schulz. Some people thought he was talking about Matt Rife, but Schulz was the one who kind of found himself in this controversy, so it seemed pretty clear that he was talking about Schulz at the time. So Schulz initially, I think, responded through DJ Academics, who is a clown who has been profiting off of throwing shit in the hip-hop community for a long time. Built an enormous platform off of it. And apparently through him, Schulz said something to the effect of what Kendrick can't take a joke, which is stupid, kind of misses the point, but gets to the fundamental argument here of should Kendrick or the black community or whoever take offense when certain lines are crossed in the context of a joke. Patrice O'Neal famously went on the news and argued with a woman who was, I think at the time, Don Imus, who was a shock jock, I think I'm getting his name right, radio guy, said something about nappy-headed hoes in the WNBA or something like that. And that caused a lot of controversy. I believe he lost his job over it. Patrice O'Neal was defending him and saying that if a comedian is trying to be funny, then they should be left alone. And if it's not funny, it's not funny. If people don't laugh, they don't laugh. And you move on. But a comedian shouldn't be punished for trying to be funny. And so Schulz is kind of appealing to the same sentiment, which plenty of comedians do. And it is directly related to their livelihood, right? Part of being able to be a comedian is you get it wrong sometimes. Sometimes you say something that's not funny, or you say something that's offensive. And maybe you say something offensive that it is funny. But if you say something offensive and it's not funny, if you did it in jest, then, is it right for somebody to come down on you for that, for you to be canceled over it, for you to lose your job over it, whatever? Schulz is not really in that position. He's not employed by anybody. He has his own platform. So even if he's, quote, canceled, the idea that his audience is going to evaporate or he's going to lose his ability to monetize his podcast, extremely unlikely. I suppose he could lose advertisers, but it doesn't seem like the heat is there in the same way that it was around 2018 or something like that. or Lord knows if he had made similar comments in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter movement and protests, that probably wouldn't have gone well for him. But either way, we're kind of in this dilemma where it's like, he made a joke. I don't even know what it was. What crossed my radar about it was that he was in hot water for saying it. So my impression is that the joke wasn't that. Actually, I do remember what it was. It was a joke about black women being violent and how being in a relationship with a black woman means that you can take a punch or something to that effect. Not a super funny joke. And it doesn't cross me as incredibly over the line, except for the fact that you're casting a wide aspersion about black women in general. So he's not even picking on a public figure and making fun of her. He is saying this about black women as a whole. And so it makes sense for people to be upset about that, and for somebody like Kendrick, who at least fancies himself as a defender of the black community and black women, to be incensed by that and to say, we as the black community, as black men, especially in the sort of militant mindset that Kendrick's in at the moment, we cannot allow people to get away with saying things like that about us. And the argument on the other side of it, the argument in favor of Kendrick's position, is that when a comedian says something like that, the fact that it's a joke doesn't really change the fact that you're throwing that impression out into the world in a way that has a major impact. And so while Andrew Schulz might be telling a joke and he has so many black friends and he doesn't mean it like that, he's a comedian, that doesn't mean that Andrew Schulz doesn't have an audience of people who are going to hear that and think it's okay to say that kind of thing, and to carry with them the idea that there's truth to that, and to carry that forward into their lives. And what that equals is racism. When people are talking about racism, prejudice, that's what they mean. It's that comedians freely casting aspersions like that, it leads to an impression, it feeds an impression that has existed for a long time. It's just another way of dividing black and white people and saying that there are inherent traits that black people have that make them violent or whatever. And so it's not wrong to call out a comedian for saying things like that and say, listen, you have an enormous platform, and when you say something like that, it makes an impact. And so while I can understand that, this is a free speech society, and I think that's a good thing, Andrew Schulz and Kendrick Lamar both benefit from that. They both profit from their free speech in this society. And Kendrick himself is pushing the boundaries of that free speech these days. And he always has to an extent, but especially these days. I mean, the stuff that he's saying now, it's very militant. Kendrick has never been a real, any type of actual revolutionary, which I've talked about in previous videos, but still, the militant type of talk that he's throwing out there, it is pushing up against the boundaries of what you could call acceptable speech in society. And I think that's a good thing. And I think to an extent it's a good thing when comedians do it as well. But the issue that we haven't really resolved as a society is that when a white comedian says something about black people, it has a different impact than when a black comedian casts aspersions about white people. And you have a lot of people out there that want to make those the same thing. Well, it's okay for Andrew Schulz to say this about black women because black comedians make fun of white people all the time. But if you look at it from a societal perspective, where we are as a society, acting like there is an equivalence there is foolish, because there's an entire history of racism in the States that comedy and making jokes plays no small part in. making jokes specifically like the one that Andrew Schulz made, which is not a very well thought out joke. It's callous, it's harsh, it's pretty mean-spirited. That is a core part of what has proliferated racism through our society. Casually joking about a different race being lesser. And so I personally think it's relatively bad for anybody of any race to do that. But the core of what Kendrick's saying is letting a white comedian say things like that about black women is especially bad. And I agree with that. So Schulz's response to this was to say that while he's not a street guy, he's not in the streets, and he recognizes that the streets would tear him limb from limb, they would shoot him, they would kill him, and that he has no standing there, which he's correct about. He also says that Kendrick, he basically points out that Kendrick's a small guy, and the way he chooses to say that is that if it was Kendrick versus him, Andrew Schulz, he would make love to him, quote, and there's nothing he could do about it. He says that he would rape Kendrick Lamar. Like, he literally says that. And it's a weird fucking thing to say. Of all the things you could say, of all the ways you could make that same exact point, I don't know if there's any way that you could have made it weirder than by saying that. It's an incredibly weird fucking thing to say. And I think it kind of, it gets to the core of this in a way that we hadn't quite reached before. Because if you start at the starting point of Schulz saying these racist things as a joke, Kendrick responds, says, hey, actually, I don't take that as a joke. And I think that, you know, there should be consequences for saying things like that. Schulz's response is to make this weird sexual joke about Kendrick. And I can kind of understand the tone in which he's saying it, but it shows that there is a fundamental weirdness about this person. Andrew Schulz is not a normal guy. And I think a lot of these comedians are able to disguise their extremely weird, mean-spirited nature behind jokes. And a lot of times, it takes a very small amount of poking and prodding to unravel that. The weird, gross, mean-spiritedness that exists at the center of the person, right? Because once it's not about jokes anymore, but it's about, hey, actually, I'm going to hold you accountable for what you said. His response is not just to point out that Kendrick is small and that he could beat him up, which is arguably not true. I mean, Kendrick, you know, he is a small guy, but he also trains. And so I'm not that confident that Andrew Schulz would automatically win a fight against Kendrick. But even beyond that, he decides to make it this weird, emasculating thing of saying that he could rape Kendrick if he wanted to. So, first of all, like I said, this just makes things so weird. It's such a weird fucking thing to say. And makes it way weirder than it ever needed to be. Even if you wanted to keep going and to continue trying to provoke reactions out of Kendrick and whoever else. To say that just shows such a weird lack of restraint and a disconnect from sort of the rest of humanity that is kind of at the core of what would lead to him getting in trouble for a joke in the first place. And he's got this panel of clapping seals that laugh around, you crazy, bro, you crazy. That's the response of the people that he's sitting there with on his podcast. So he's surrounded himself with yes men who are not going to point out the fact that, like, hey, not only is that a weird fucking thing to say, but you could and might legitimately lose your life for saying that. People have been killed over much, much less. So I don't think Kendrick is, Kendrick doesn't have bodies under his belt. And even if you extrapolate further and like, Kendrick is not known for, putting hits out on people, for lack of a more subtle phrase. He's just not known for that. But the way he's talking recently doesn't seem like he's above it either. Do I think that anything's going to happen to Andrew Schulz? Probably not. Do I think it's out of the realm of possibility? Definitely it isn't. And the way he's talking, it kind of seems like he thinks it's out of the realm of possibility. So I don't know how Kendrick is going to respond to that. It's entirely possible that he won't, because his original objection to Andrew Schulz was that he was making fun of black women. So it's entirely possible that Kendrick's attitude would be, you could say whatever you want about me, I don't give a fuck, but if you talk about black women, I'm going to check you. I don't think that's going to be the case, because it's such a weird, personal, and gross thing to say about somebody. So it seems like he's going to respond in some way. It stands to reason that he would. Whether he is going to respond in a song, or whether he's going to send somebody to make some threat, or, make some kind of veiled threat in some way towards Schulz, remains to be seen. It's not out of the realm of possibility. And it does seem like, with the attitude that Kendrick has lately, that he's probably going to respond in some way. So we'll see what happens. But to me, the conclusion here, the long and short of it, is that by just pushing back a little on Schulz's original comments and saying, we're not going to actually let you get away with kind of like dancing your way out of that. You should be held accountable for what you said. And in the streets, being held accountable means a much different thing than on the internet or in a court of law. And maybe that's the kind of thing people should be more careful about going forward when it comes to making certain jokes. It's not about whether the police or the cancel culture is going to come for you. It's about, if you piss somebody off enough with your comments, they might come for you. And maybe some of these comedians could stand to have a little bit more of that pressure in their lives. So Andrew Schulz seems to be giving off the air that he doesn't care about that, and he's going to say what he wants. And hey, if it wasn't for the disgusting nature, like the literally disgusting nature of what he said, I would say that that's admirable. But, he's putting himself in a position here where he's daring Kendrick and the people that support Kendrick to do something. And I'm not saying I want to see that happen. I don't want to see anything bad happen to anybody. But, all it takes is just a little push for a person like that to reveal how truly weird and gross and disconnected from humanity they actually are. And I think that's the real problem here. The problem is not making one or two jokes about black people. The problem is that you are fundamentally inhuman. And that is what is being indicated by some of these things that you're saying. And I think that applies to a lot of comedians. That it's not just that your jokes are offensive, it's that they reflect really, really badly on you. And I don't know if there's a better example of that than Andrew Schulz making these comments. It's one of the weirdest and strangest, most inexcusable things I've ever heard a comedian say. So we'll see, man. This is a friend of Charlamagne the God. He's not without connections to the hip-hop community. I'm sure Charlamagne might even give him a call over this. And we'll see, I doubt we're going to see any contrition from Andrew Schulz unless somebody pays him a visit, in which case we very well might. But I do think, in my personal opinion, it would not be bad at all for us to see a humbling of a guy like this, because it's a weird fucking thing to say. And, it gets to the core of the issue, which is, the government doesn't have to impose any restrictions on your free speech for there to be consequences for what you say. And, we'll see what happens.